Veritatis Splendor, Part 6. Chapter 3. Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. 1 Corinthians 1:17. Moral good for the life of the Church and of the world. For freedom Christ has set us free. Galatians 5:1. The fundamental question which the moral theories mentioned above pose in a particularly forceful way is that of the relationship of man's freedom to God's law. It is ultimately the question of the relationship between freedom and truth. According to Christian faith and the Church's teaching, only the freedom which submits to the truth leads the human person to his true good. The good of the person is to be in the truth and to do the truth. A comparison between the Church's teaching and today's social and cultural situation immediately makes clear the urgent need for the Church herself to develop an intense pastoral effort precisely with regard to this fundamental question. This essential bond between the truth, the good, and freedom has been largely lost sight of by present-day culture. As a result, helping man to rediscover it represents nowadays one of the specific requirements of the Church's mission for the salvation of the world. Pilate's question, "What is truth?" reflects the distressing perplexity of a man who often no longer knows who he is, whence he comes, and where he is going. Hence we not infrequently witness the fearful plunging of the human person into situations of gradual self-destruction. According to some, it appears that one no longer need acknowledge the enduring absoluteness of any moral value. All around us we encounter contempt for human life, after conception and before birth. The ongoing violation of basic rights of the person, the unjust destruction of goods minimally necessary for a human life. Indeed, something more serious has happened. Man is no longer convinced that only in the truth can he find salvation. The saving power of the truth is contested, and freedom alone, uprooted from any objectivity, is left to decide by itself what is good and what is evil. This relativism becomes, in the field of theology, a lack of trust in the wisdom of God, who guides man with the moral law. Concrete situations are unfavorably contrasted with the precepts of the moral law, nor is it any longer maintained that, when all is said and done, the law of God is always the one true good of man. The discernment which the Church carries out with regard to these ethical theories is not simply limited to denouncing and refuting them. In a positive way, the Church seeks, with great love, to help all the faithful to form a moral conscience, which will make judgments and lead to decisions in accordance with the truth, following the exhortation of the Apostle Paul, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Romans 12:2. This effort by the Church finds its support, the secret of its educative power, not so much in doctrinal statements and pastoral appeals to vigilance, as in constantly looking to the Lord Jesus. Each day the Church looks to Christ with unfailing love, fully aware that the true and final answer to the problem of morality lies in him alone. In a particular way, it is in the crucified Christ that the Church finds the answer to the question troubling so many people today: how can obedience to universal and unchanging moral norms respect the uniqueness and individuality of the person, and not make a threat to his freedom and dignity. The Church makes her own the Apostle Paul's awareness of the mission he had received. Christ sent me to preach the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, lest the cross be emptied of its power. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. 1 Corinthians 1:17, 23-24. The crucified Christ reveals the authentic meaning of freedom. He lives it fully in the total gift of himself and calls his disciples to share in his freedom. Rational reflection and daily experience demonstrate the weakness which marks man's freedom. That freedom is real but limited. Its absolute and unconditional origin is not in itself, but in the life within which it is situated, and which represents for it, at one and the same time, both a limitation and a possibility. Human freedom belongs to us as creatures. It is a freedom which is given as a gift, one to be received like a seed, and to be cultivated responsibly. It is an essential part of that creaturely image, which is the basis of the dignity of the person. Within that freedom there is an echo of the primordial vocation, whereby the Creator calls man to the true good, and even more, through Christ's revelation, to become his friend and to share his own divine life. It is at once inalienable self-possession and openness to all that exists, in passing beyond self to knowledge and love of the other. Freedom, then, is rooted in the truth about man, and it is ultimately directed towards communion. Reason and experience not only confirm the weakness of human freedom, they also confirm its tragic aspects. Man comes to realize that his freedom is in some mysterious way inclined to betray this openness to the true and the good, and all that too often he actually prefers to choose finite, limited, and ephemeral goods. What is more, within his errors and negative decisions, man glimpses the source of a deep rebellion, which leads him to reject the truth and the good in order to set himself up as an absolute principle unto himself. You will be like God. Genesis 3:5. Consequently, freedom itself needs to be set free. It is Christ who sets it free. He has set us free for freedom. Christ reveals, first and foremost, that the frank and open acceptance of truth is the condition for authentic freedom. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. This is truth which sets one free in the face of worldly power, and which gives strength to endure martyrdom. So it was with Jesus before Pilate. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. John 18:37. The true worshippers of God must thus worship him in spirit and in truth. John 4:23. In this worship they become free. Worship of God and a foundation with truth are revealed in Jesus Christ as the deepest foundation of freedom. Furthermore, Jesus reveals by his whole life, and not only by his words, that freedom is acquired in love, that is, in the gift of self. The one who says, "Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," John 15:13, freely goes out to meet his passion. Matthew 26:46. And in obedience to the Father gives his life on the cross for all men. Contemplation of Jesus crucified is thus the high road which the Church must tread every day if she wishes to understand the full meaning of freedom, the gift of self in service to God and one's brethren. Communion with the crucified and risen Lord is the never-ending source from which the Church draws unceasingly in order to live in freedom, to give of herself and to serve. Commenting on the verse in Psalm 100, "Serve the Lord with gladness," St. Augustine says, "In the house of the Lord, slavery is free. It is free because it serves not out of necessity, but out of charity. Charity would make you a servant, just as truth has made you free. You are at once both a servant and free. A servant because you have become such, free because you are loved by God your Creator. Indeed, you have also been enabled to love your Creator. You are a servant of the Lord, and you are a freedman of the Lord. Do not go looking for a liberation which will lead you far from the house of your liberator." The Church, and each of her members, is thus called to share in the munus regali of the crucified Christ, to share in the grace and in the responsibility of the Son of Man who came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Matthew 20:28. Jesus, then, is the living, personal summation of perfect freedom in total obedience to the will of God. His crucified flesh fully reveals the unbreakable bond between freedom and truth, just as his resurrection from the dead is the supreme exaltation of the fruitfulness and saving power of a freedom lived out in truth. Walking in the light. 1 John 1:7. The attempt to set freedom in opposition to truth, and indeed to separate them radically, is the consequence, manifestation, and consummation of another more serious and destructive dichotomy, which separates faith from morality. This separation represents one of the most acute pastoral concerns of the Church amid today's growing secularism, wherein many, indeed too many, people think and live as if God did not exist. We are speaking of a mentality which affects, often in a profound, extensive, and all-embracing way, even the attitudes and behavior of Christians, whose faith is weakened and loses its character as a new and original criterion for thinking and acting in personal, family, and social life. In a widely de-Christianized culture, the criteria employed by believers themselves in making judgments and decisions often appear extraneous or even contrary to those of the gospel. It is urgent that Christians should rediscover the newness of the faith and its power to judge, a prevalent and all-intrusive culture. As the Apostle Paul admonishes us, "Once you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the fruitful words of darkness, but instead expose them. Look carefully, then, how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making most of the time, because the days are evil." Ephesians 5:8-11, 15 and 16. 1 Thessalonians 5:4-8. It is urgent to rediscover and to set forth once more the authentic reality of the Christian faith, which is not simply a set of propositions to be accepted and with intellectual assent. Rather, faith is a lived knowledge of Christ, a living remembrance of his commandments, and a truth to be lived out. A word, in any event, is not truly received until it passes into action, until it is put into practice. Faith is a decision involving one's whole existence. It is an encounter, a dialogue, a communion of love and life between the believer and Jesus Christ, the way and the truth and the light. It entails an act of trusting abandonment to Christ, which enables us to live as he lived, Galatians 2:20, in profound love of God and of our brothers and sisters. Faith also possesses a moral content. It gives rise to and calls for a consistent life commitment. It entails and brings to perfection the acceptance and observance of God's commandments. As St. John writes, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not live according to the truth. And by this we may be sure that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, but disobeys his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly love for God is perfected. By this we may be sure that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. 1 John 1:5-6, 2:3-6. Through the moral life, faith becomes confession, not only before God but also before men. It becomes witness. You are the light of the world, said Jesus. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 5:14-16. These works are above those of charity, and of the authentic freedom which is manifested and lived in the gift of self, even to the total gift of self, like that of Jesus, who on the cross loved the church and gave himself up for her. Ephesians 5:25. Christ's witness is the source, model, and means for the witness of his disciples, who are called to walk on the same road. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Luke 9:23. Charity, in conformity with the radical demands of the gospel, can lead the believer to the supreme witness of martyrdom. Once again, this means imitating Jesus who died on the cross. Be imitators of God, as beloved children, Paul writes to the Christians of Ephesus, and walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Ephesians 5:1-2. Martyrdom, the exaltation of the inviolable holiness of God's law. The relationship between faith and morality shines forth with all its brilliance in the unconditional respect due to the insistent demands of the personal dignity of every man. demands protected by those whose moral norms which prohibit, without exception, actions which are intrinsically evil. The universality and the immutability of the moral norm makes manifest and at the same time serve to protect the personal dignity and inviolability of man, on whose face is reflected the splendor of God. Genesis 9:5 and 6. The unacceptability of teleological, consequentialist, and proportionalist ethical theories, which deny the existence of negative moral norms regarding specific kinds of behavior, norms which are valid without exception, is confirmed in a particular eloquent way by Christian martyrdom, which has always accompanied and continues to accompany the life of the Church, even today. In the Old Testament we already find admirable witnesses of fidelity to the holy law of God, even to the point of a voluntary acceptance of death. A prime example is the story of Susanna. In reply to the two unjust judges who threatened to have her condemned to death if she refused to yield to their sinful passion, she says, "I am hemmed in on every side. For if I do this thing, it is death for me, and if I do not, I shall not escape your hands. I choose not to do it and fall into your hands, rather than to sin in the sight of the Lord." Daniel 13:22-23. Susanna, referring to fall innocent into the hands of the judges, bears witnesses not only to her faith and trust in God, but also to her obedience to the truth and to the absoluteness of the moral order. By her readiness to die a martyr, she proclaims that it is not right to do what God's law qualifies as evil, in order to draw some good from it. Susanna chose for herself the better part. Hers was a perfectly clear witness, without any compromise, to the truth about the good and the God of Israel. By her acts, she reveals the holiness of God. At the dawn of the New Testament, John the Baptist, unable to refrain from speaking of the law of the Lord and rejecting any compromise with evil, gave his life in witness to truth and justice, and thus also became the forerunner of the Messiah in the way he died, the one who came to bear witness to the light, and who deserved to be called by that same light, which is Christ, a burning and shining lamp, was cast into the darkness of prison. The one to whom it was granted to baptize the Redeemer of the world was thus baptized in his own blood. In the New Testament we find many examples of followers of Christ, beginning with the deacon Stephen, Acts 6:8, 7:60, and the Apostle James, Acts 12:1 and 2, who died as martyrs in order to profess their faith and their love for Christ, unwilling to deny him. In this they followed the Lord Jesus, who made the good confession, 1 Timothy 6:13, before Caiaphas and Pilate, confirming the truth of his message at the cost of his life. Countless other martyrs accepted persecution and death rather than perform the idolatrous act of burning incense before a statue of the emperor. Revelations 13:7-10. They even refused to feign such worship, thereby giving an example of the duty to refrain from performing even a single concrete act contrary to God's love and the witness of faith. Like Christ himself, They obediently trusted and handed over their lives to the Father, the one who could free them from death. The Church proposes the example of numerous saints who bore witness to and defended moral truth even to the point of enduring martyrdom, and who preferred death to a single mortal sin. In raising them to the honor of the altars, the Church has canonized their witness and declared the truth of their judgment, according to which the love of God entails the obligation to respect his commandments, even in the most dire of circumstances, and the refusal to betray those commandments, even for the sake of saving one's own life. Martyrdom, accepted as an affirmation of the inviolability of the moral order, bears splendid witness both to the holiness of God's law and to the inviolability of the personal dignity of man, created in God's image and likeness. This dignity may never be disparaged or called into question, even with good intentions, whatever the difficulties involved. Jesus warns us most sternly, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life?" Mark 8:36. Martyrdom rejects as false and illusory whatever human meaning one might claim to attribute, even in exceptional conditions, to an act morally evil in itself. Indeed, it even more clearly unmasks the true face of such an act. It is a violation of man's humanity in the one perpetrating it even before the one enduring it. Hence martyrdom is also the exaltation of a person's perfect humanity and of true life, as is attested by St. Ignatius of Antioch, addressing the Christians of Rome, the place of his own martyrdom. "Have mercy on me, brethren. Do not hold me back from living. Do not wish that I die. Let me arrive at the pure light, and once there I will be truly a man. Let me imitate the passion of my God." Finally, martyrdom is an outstanding sign of the holiness of the Church. Fidelity to God's holy law, witnessed to by the death, is a solemn proclamation and missionary commitment, usque ad sanguinum, so that the splendor of moral truth may be undimmed in the behavior and thinking of individuals and society. This witness makes an extraordinarily valuable contribution to warding off, in civil society and within the ecclesial communities themselves, a headlong plunge into the most dangerous crisis which can afflict man, the confusion between good and evil, which makes it impossible to build up and to preserve the moral order of individuals and communities. By their eloquent and attractive example of a life completely transfigured by the splendor of moral truth, the martyrs, and, in general, all of the Church's saints, light up every period of history by reawakening its moral sense. By witnessing fully to the good, they are a living reproof to those who transgress the law. And they make the words of the prophet echo ever afresh. "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." Isaiah 5:20. Although martyrdom represents the high point of the witness to moral truth, and one to which relatively few people are called, there is nonetheless a consistent witness which all Christians must daily be ready to make, even at the cost of suffering and grave sacrifice. Indeed, faced with the many difficulties which fidelity to the moral order can demand, even in the most ordinary circumstances, the Christian is called, with the grace of God invoked in prayer, to a sometimes heroic commitment. In this he or she is sustained by the virtue of fortitude, whereby, as Gregory the Great teaches, one can actually love the difficulties of this world for the sake of eternal rewards. In this witness to the absoluteness of the moral good, Christians are not alone. They are supported by the moral sense present in peoples, and by the great religious and sapiential traditions of East and West, from which the interior and mysterious working of God's Spirit are not absent. The words of the Latin poet Juvenal apply to all. Consider it the greatest of crimes to prefer survival to honor, and, out of love and physical life, to lose the very reason for living. The voice of conscience has always clearly recalled that there are truths and moral values for which one must be prepared to give up one's life. In an individual's word, and above all in the sacrifice of his life for a moral value, the Church sees a single testimony to that truth which, already present in creation, shines forth in its fullness on the face of Christ. As St. Justin put it, the Stoics, at least in their teachings on ethics, demonstrated wisdom, thanks to the seed of the word present in all peoples, and we know that those who follow their doctrines met with hatred and were killed. Universal and unchanging moral norms at the service of the person and of society. The Church's teaching, and in particular her firmness in defending the universal and permanent validity of the precepts prohibiting intrinsically evil acts, is not infrequently seen as the sign of an intolerable intransigence, particularly with regard to the enormously complex and conflict-filled situations present in the moral life of individuals and of society itself. This intransigence is said to be in contrast with the Church's motherhood. The Church, one hears, is lacking in understanding and compassion. But the Church's motherhood can never in fact be separated from her teaching mission, which she must always carry out as the faithful bride of Christ, who is the truth in person. As teacher, she never tires of proclaiming the moral norm. The Church is in no way the author or arbiter of this norm. In obedience to the truth, which is Christ, whose image is reflected in the nature and dignity of the human person, the Church interprets the moral norm and proposes it to all people of good will, without concealing its demands of radicalness and perfection. In fact, genuine understanding and compassion must mean love for the person, for his true good, and for his authentic freedom. This does not result, certainly, from concealing or weakening moral truth, but rather from proposing it in its most profound meaning, and as an outpouring of God's eternal wisdom, which we have received in Christ, and as a service to man, to the growth of his freedom and to the attainment of his happiness. Still, a clear and forceful presentation of moral truth can never be separated from a profound and heartfelt respect, born of that patient and trusting love which man always needs along his moral journey, a journey frequently wearisome on account of difficulties, weakness, and painful situations. The Church can never renounce the principle of truth and consistency, whereby she does not agree to call good evil and evil good. She must always be careful not to break the bruised reed, or to quench the dimly burning wick. As Paul VI wrote, while it is an outstanding manifestation of charity towards souls to omit nothing from the saving doctrine of Christ, this must always be joined with tolerance and charity, as Christ himself showed by his conversations and dealings with men. Having not come to judge the world but to save it, he was uncompromisingly stern towards sin, but patient and rich in mercy towards sinners. The Church's firmness in defending the universal and unchanging moral norms is not demeaning at all. Its only purpose is to serve man's true freedom. Because there can be no freedom apart or in opposition to the truth, the categorical, unyielding, and uncompromising defense of the absolutely essential demands of man's personal dignity must be considered the way and the condition for the very existence of freedom. This service is directed to every man, considered in the uniqueness and singularity of his being and existence. Only by obedience to universal moral norms does man find full confirmation of his personal uniqueness and the possibility of authentic moral growth. For this very reason, this service is also directed to all mankind. It is not only for individuals but also for the community, for society as such. These norms, in fact, represent the unshakable foundation and solid guarantee of a just and peaceful human coexistence, and hence of genuine democracy, which can come into being and develop only on the basis of the equality of all its members, who possess common rights and duties. When it is a matter of the moral norms prohibiting intrinsic evil, there are no privileges or exceptions for anyone. It makes no difference whether one is master of the world or the poorest of the poor on the face of the earth. Before the demands of morality, we are all absolutely equal. In this way, moral norms, and primarily the negative ones, those prohibiting evil, manifest their meaning and force, both personal and social. By protecting the inviolable human personal dignity of every human being, they help preserve the human social fabric with its proper and fruitful development. The commandments of the second table of the Decalogue, in particular, those which Jesus quoted to the young man of the Gospel, constitute the indispensable rules of all social life. These commandments are formulated in general terms, but the very fact that the origin, the subject, and the purpose of all social institutions is and should be the human person, allows for them to be specified and made more explicit in a detailed code of behavior. The fundamental moral rules of social life thus entail specific demands to which both public authorities and citizens are required to pay heed. Even though intentions may sometimes be good, and circumstances frequently difficult, civil authorities and particular individuals never have authority to violate the fundamental and inalienable rights of the human person. In the end, only a morality acknowledges certain norms as valid always and for everyone, with no exception, can guarantee the ethical foundation of social coexistence, both on the national and international levels. Morality and the renewal of social and political life. In the face of serious forms of social and economic injustice and political corruption affecting entire peoples and nations, there is a growing reaction of indignation on the part of very many people whose fundamental human rights have been trampled upon and held in contempt. as well as an ever more widespread and acute sense of the need for a radical personal and social renewal capable of ensuring justice, solidarity, honesty, and openness. Certainly there is a long and difficult road ahead. Bringing about such a renewal will require enormous effort, especially on account of the number and the gravity of the causes giving rise to and aggravating the situations of injustice present in the world today. But as history and personal experience show, it is not difficult to discover at the bottom of these situations causes which are properly cultural, linked to particular ways of looking at man, society, and the world. Indeed, at the heart of the issue of culture we find the moral sense, which is in turn rooted and fulfilled in the religious sense. Only God, the supreme good, constitutes the unshakable foundation and essential condition of morality, and thus of the commandments, particularly those negative commandments which always and in every case prohibit behavior and actions incompatible with the personal dignity of every man. The supreme good and the moral good meet in truth, the truth of God, the Creator and Redeemer, and the truth of man, created and redeemed by him. Only upon this truth is it possible to construct a renewed society and to solve the complex and weighty problems affecting it. Above all, the problem of overcoming the various forms of totalitarianism so as to make way for authentic freedom of the person. Totalitarianism arises out of a denial of truth in the objective sense. If there is no transcendent truth, in obedience to which man achieves his full identity, then there is no sure principle for guaranteeing just relations between people. Their self-interest as a class, group, or nation would inevitably set them in opposition to one another. If one does not acknowledge transcendent truth, then the force of power takes over, and each person tends to make full use of the means at his disposal in order to impose his own interests or his own opinion, with no regard for the rights of others. Thus the root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who, as the visible image of the invisible God, is therefore by his very nature the subject of rights which no one may violate. No individual, group, class, nation, or state, not even the majority of a social body may violate these rights by going against the minority, by isolating, oppressing, or exploiting it, or by attempting to annihilate it. Consequently, the inseparable connection between truth and freedom, which expresses the essential bond between God's wisdom and will, is extremely significant for the life of persons in the socio-economic and socio-political sphere. This is clearly seen in the Church's social teaching, which belongs to the field of theology, and particularly of moral theology, and from her presentation of commandments governing social, economic, and political life, not only with regard to general attitudes, but also to precise and specific kinds of behavior and concrete acts. The Catechism of the Catholic Church affirms that, in economic matters, respect for human dignity requires the practice of the virtue of temperance to moderate our attachment to the goods of this world, and of the virtue of justice to preserve our neighbor's rights and to render what is his or her due, and of solidarity, following the Golden Rule, and in keeping with the generosity of the Lord, who, though he was rich, yet for your sake became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. 2 Corinthians 8:9. The Catechism goes on to present a series of kinds of behavior and actions contrary to human dignity: theft, deliberate retention of goods lent or objects lost, business fraud, unjust wages, forcing up prices by trading on the ignorance or hardship of another, the misappropriation and private use of the corporate property of an enterprise, work badly done, tax fraud, forgery of checks and invoices, excessive expenses, wastes, etc. It continues, the seventh commandment prohibits action or enterprises which, for any reason, selfish or ideological, commercial or totalitarian, lead to the enslavement of human beings, disregard for their personal dignity, buying or selling or exchanging them like merchandise. Reducing persons by violence to use value or a source of profit is a sin against their dignity as persons and their fundamental rights. St. Paul sent a Christian master write about treating his Christian slave no longer as a slave, but as a brother in the Lord, Philemon 16. In the political sphere, it must be noted that truthfulness in the relations between those governing and those governed, openness in public administration, impartiality in the service of the body politic, respect for the rights of political adversaries, safeguarding the rights of the accused against summary trials and convictions, the just and honest use of public funds, the rejection of equivocal or illicit means in order to gain, preserve or increase power at any cost, all these are principles which are primarily rooted in, and in fact derive their singular urgency from, the transcendent value of the person, and the objective moral demands of the functioning of states. When these principles are not observed, the very basis of political coexistence is weakened, and the life of society itself is gradually jeopardized, threatened and doomed to decay. Today, when many countries have seen the fall of ideologies which bound politics to a totalitarian conception of the world, Marxism being the foremost of these, there is no less grave a danger than the fundamental rights of the human person will be denied, and that religious yearnings will arise in the heart of every human being, will be absorbed once again into politics. This is the risk of an alliance between democracy and ethical relativism, which would remove any sure moral reference point from political and social life, and, on a deeper level, make the acknowledgement of truth impossible. Indeed, no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. Thus, in every sphere of personal, family, social, and political life, morality, founded upon truth and open in truth to authentic freedom, renders a primordial, indispensable, and immensely valuable service not only for the individual person and his growth in the good, but also for society and its genuine development. Grace and obedience to God's law. Even in the most difficult situations, man must respect the norm of morality, so that he can be obedient to God's holy commandment, and consistent with his own dignity as a person. Certainly, maintaining a harmony between freedom and truth occasionally demands uncommon sacrifices, and must be won at a high price. It can even involve martyrdom. But, as universal and daily experience demonstrates, man is tempted to break that harmony. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want. Romans 7:15 and 19. What is the ultimate source of this inner division of man? His history of sin begins when he no longer acknowledges the Lord as his creator, and himself wishes to be the one who determines, with complete independence, what is good and what is evil. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. Genesis 3:5. This was the first temptation, and it is echoed in all the other temptations to which man is more easily inclined to yield as a result of the original fall. But temptations can be overcome, sins can be avoided, because together with the commandments the Lord gives us the possibility of keeping them. His eyes are on those who fear him, and he knows every deed of man. He has not commanded anyone to be ungodly, and he has not given anyone permission to sin. Sirach 15:19 and 20. Keeping God's law in particular situations can be difficult, and extremely difficult, but it is never impossible. This is the constant teaching of the Church's tradition, and was expressed by the Council of Trent. But no one, however much justified, ought to consider himself exempt from the observance of the commandments, nor should he employ that rash statement, forbidden by the Fathers under anathema, that the commandments of God are impossible of observance by one who is justified. For God does not command the impossible, but in commanding he admonishes you to do what you can and to pray for what you cannot, and he gives his aid to enable you. His commandments are not burdensome. His yoke is easy and his burden light. Man always has before him the spiritual horizon of hope, thanks to the help of divine grace with the cooperation of human freedom. It is in the saving cross of Jesus, in the gift of the Holy Spirit, in the sacraments which flow forth from the purest side of the Redeemer, that believers find the grace and the strength always to keep God's holy law, even amid the gravest of hardships. As St. Andrew of Crete observes, the law itself was enlivened by grace and made to serve it in a harmonious and fruitful combination. Each element preserved its characteristics without change or confusion. In a divine manner, he turned what could be burdensome and tyrannical into what is easy to bear and a source of freedom. Only in the mystery of Christ's redemption do we discover the concrete possibilities of man. It would be a very serious error to conclude that the Church's teaching is essentially only an ideal, which must then be adapted, proportioned, graduated to the so-called concrete possibilities of man, according to a balancing of the goods in question. But what are the concrete possibilities of man, and of which man are we speaking? Of man dominated by lust, or man redeemed by Christ? This is what is at stake, the reality of Christ's redemption. Christ has redeemed us. This means that he has given us the possibility of realizing the entire truth of our being. he has set our freedom free from the domination of concupiscence. And if, redeemed, man still sins, this is not due to an imperfection of Christ's redemptive act, but to man's will not to avail himself of the grace which flows from that act. God's command is, of course, proportioned to man's capabilities, but to the capabilities of the man to whom the Holy Spirit has been given, of the man who, though he has fallen into sin, can always obtain pardon and enjoy the presence of the Holy Spirit. In this context, appropriate allowance is made both for God's mercy towards the sinner who converts and for the understanding of human weakness. Such understanding never means compromising and falsifying the standard of good and evil in order to adapt it to particular circumstances. It is quite human for the sinner to acknowledge his weakness and to ask mercy for his failings. What is unacceptable is the attitude of one who makes his own weakness the criterion of the truth about the good, so that he can feel self-justified, without even the need to have recourse to God and his mercy. An attitude of this sort corrupts the morality of society as a whole, since it encourages doubt about the objectivity of the moral law in general, and a rejection of the absoluteness of moral prohibitions regarding specific human acts, and it ends up by confusing all judgments about values. Instead, we should take to heart the message of the gospel parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The tax collector might possibly have had some justification for the sins he committed, such as to diminish his responsibility, but his prayer does not dwell on such justifications, but rather on his own unworthiness before God's infinite holiness. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Luke 18:13. The Pharisee, on the other hand, is self-justified, finding some excuse for each of his failings. Here we encounter two different attitudes of the moral conscience of man in every age. The tax collector represents a repentant conscience, fully aware of the frailty of its own nature and seeing in its own failings, whatever their subjective justifications, a confirmation of its need for redemption. The Pharisee represents a self-satisfied conscience, under the illusion that it is able to observe the law without the help of grace and convinced that it does not need mercy. All people must take great care not to allow themselves to be tainted by the attitude of the Pharisee, which would seek to eliminate awareness of one's own limits and of one's own sin. In our own day, this attitude is expressed particularly in the attempt to adapt the moral norm of one's own capacities and personal interests, and even in the rejection of the very idea of a norm. Accepting, on the other hand, the disproportion between law and human ability, that is, the capacity of the moral forces of man left to himself, kindles the desire for grace and prepares one to receive it. Who will deliver me from this body of death? Asks the Apostle Paul. And in an outburst of joy and gratitude he replies, Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Romans 7:24-25. We find the same awareness in the following prayer of St. Ambrose of Milan. What then is man, if you do not visit him? Remember, Lord, that you have made me as one who is weak, that you formed me from the dust. How can I stand if you do not constantly look upon me to strengthen this clay, so that my strength may proceed from your face? When you hide your face, all grows weak. If you turn to look at me, woe is me. You have nothing to see in me but the strain of my crimes. There is no gain either in being abandoned or in being seen, because when we are seen, we offend you. Still, we can imagine that God does not reject those he sees, because he purifies those whom he gazes. Before him burns a fire capable of consuming our guilt.